it's kind of amazing to see all our books behind you, just all together in the real world.
Oh.
So thank you so much to Little City Books for doing this, and to Ava and Rebecca for doing this. I know that I am not y'all's number one fan because I've seen Twitter and I just don't maintain that level of energy in my body, but I am a huge fan of your work. And I think of you as like some of the authors who have walked me back into secondary world fantasy, which is like something I'd given up on a little bit in my 20s, and I'm so excited to see it as a genre now. Um, that's first order of business. Second order of business is a huge congratulations to Ava. I hope you're having a good day. I
Aw,
know this
thank
is like
you.
stress, joy. It's a wild time. I hope you're
It's,
having a good
yeah,
day.
I woke up at 6 and then took a 3 hour nap. So that's the energy of the day. Um,
Excellent. Great choices. And then the third thing before we get started, is it your birthday, Rebecca? Or like close to?
It was my birthday a week ago, but my boyfriend planned badly and got these earrings from England that shipped very late. Because I think guys think that you can order something from Etsy and it arrives like next week, which is not how
Is that
things work.
not
yes.
the case? I mean, we say guys and I hear that, but I hear me also.
No, but his
Well, happy
present
birthday.
arrived today finally, and they're very pretty sparrow earrings. So that's why everybody thinks it's my birthday.
Well, you just get another round of congratulations and happy birthday. So anyway, all right. So I figured we should start with, as we allegedly have written books, if y'all wanted to do the 2 or 3 sentence, here's what your book or trilogy is about, I would love to hear it. Ava, if you want to start.
Sure. So here's my elevator pitch that has been practiced so many times over the past couple of months. So, The Wolf and the Woodsman is an epic but kind of literary leaning adult fantasy book inspired by kind of the history of the High Middle Ages in Hungary, and also by Hungarian and Jewish mythology. And it follows a pagan woman with hidden powers who allies herself with the disgraced prince to try and take down a tyrant.
Excellent. It's great. Go for it, Rebecca.
10,000 Doors of January about Alex.
Yeah.
Oh no, I've deleted that pitch from my head. I can only do Once and Future Witches now. Each book erases the last one in my mind. So Once and Future Witches is I sold it on a 3-word pitch, which was suffragettes but witches, and I was like, this is brilliant, I'm great. But it turns out there's like a huge difference between a pitch and a book, surprising me. So what the book turns out to be about is like 3 sisters in an extremely alternate version of late 19th century America, participating in the women's movement and turning it slowly into the witches movement. So
I feel you on forgetting how to describe your other books because I only want to talk about Babel now. But the Popular Trilogy, which actually finished quite recently, is what used to be pitched as Avatar: The Last Airbender, but Azula is the main character and everyone's on drugs, which I would say to provide some benchmarks of familiarity to people who have no understanding of 20th century Chinese history. But it's actually the vicissitudes of 20th century China transposed to a more ancient Song Dynasty setting with shamanism and drugs and magic. So that's that.
still the drugs.
The drugs remain. They were not inherent to Avatar: The Last Airbender. But Babel, which is coming out in fall of next year, is the secret history meets Jonathan Strange in 1830s Oxford. It's about language, student revolutions, translation as a tool of empire, and the necessity of violence as a decolonial response, which I get works better as an academic paper title than a book pitch, but that's
No,
what you guys are getting.
Oh, it's perfect.
Lean
That's
in.
what we're here for.
Well, what's great is that both of those, your trilogy and this book, are concerned with kind of our theme tonight, which is kind of inherent. I think you can hear it in our pitches. These are books about power, and particularly maybe state power and how individuals interact with state power. And so the first thing I wanted to start with is just sort of like how you personally got there. Like the themes in novels are generally pretty like significant and personal, sometimes themes in novelists' lives, and I'm curious what brought you to questions of state and nation.
Um, so I'm not like a proper academic like you guys, but
No,
I
I'm not
did.
either. I'm not either. Rebecca's real. Don't worry.
But ethnic nationalism and religion, as is in my bio, yeah, that was kind of the focus of my undergraduate degree. And I think like once you start there and you start thinking about like ethnic minorities, like you inherently end up, you know, thinking about the state as like a tool of violence. Or maybe I'm just obsessed with power. My boyfriend sometimes accuses me of being obsessed with power. And I was going to say not in a Machiavellian sense, but that's actually exactly the way that I mean, like in a Hobbesian Machiavellian sense. Like, I don't know. I also just went to Columbia, so like all my professors were like ancient white men who were obsessed with real politics. So that might explain it, honestly.
What about you, Rebecca?
Well, I so I wonder where do I begin? I'm interested in group psychology and what starts movements. And this is going to sound cheesy because we just watched Inception because my boyfriend wanted to. But in Inception, Leonardo DiCaprio repeats the line like an idea is like a germ, takes root in you like again and again. And I think it's really fascinating how really simple ideas spiral into these massive bloody conflicts, like if you look at the 20th century, it's like a history of like simple ideas like proliferating and causing disastrous things, like the simple idea of the Japanese Empire or the simple idea of Marxism in China. And I wonder how they become so compelling that you can form a movement and you can get a whole army behind you and you can get like people to bleed and die for your cause with simple words. And okay, I promise this is the last time I'll talk about Benedict Anderson, but since we're talking about nationalism, it's really interesting in fantasy because like Anderson's whole argument is that we get nationalism from the printing press because the printing press allows us to have imagined communities, and so there's like the whole thing with like simultaneity and experiencing the same events in the world the same way because we're all reading the same newspapers and we can imagine people we've never met before. And you all know this, right? Like we can imagine people that we don't know, like being on our same side, fighting for the same cause. But interesting about the thing about a lot of secondary world fantasy is that it's pre-printing
It's
press.
pre-printing press.
Yeah.
I know. And I
So
mean, isn't that a very like Western and technocratic vision of what nationalism is? Is a nation state necessarily associated with that specific technology? I'm very curious about this.
well, I was gonna say, well, no, I'm not sure, but I was gonna say if we don't have the printing press, then what stands as its substitute? And I'll just really cut to the chase here. I think it's stories, right? And myths that we tell about ourselves. Those are the only things that spread and have the same sort of lasting power as like a newspaper. And so if you're talking about a pre-printing press nation or kingdom, like the glue that holds it all together is myths that they all believe about each other and where this kingdom came from and the ruler, which is something that's really at the heart of the Wolf and the Woodsman. So Ava, I'm really curious to hear your takes on the kind of myths that you came up with that these groups believe in and that are at the heart of their conflicts.
Yeah, so of course you brought up Benedict Anderson. I literally tried to use Benedict Anderson as like a comp title for my book, but David was like, no, stop, you have to stop. Um, yeah, I mean, I just think that the idea of a national mythology is so incredibly powerful, but it's not actually something you see. It kind of sits behind the scenes in a lot of secondary world fantasy, but it's never like at the fore in something that's kind of being actively contested. Like I think that was the interesting part for me, was to have like a nation that's still in the process of building itself and creating its own identity. Like yes, nations can also have identity crises just like people. So I kind of wanted to write a book about a nation that was in flux in that sense, and a nation where these myths were really, really important because they confer, actual like magic power, but also like, you know, figurative power. And the reason why, I mean, I guess minor spoilers, the reason why the king doesn't just completely, you know, annihilate paganism is because he recognizes both the hard and the soft power that it grants him the legitimacy that it grants his regime.
Which, two things that I really loved about your use of folklore and the invented kind of folklore of this nation was that there's different versions of the same stories and they're contested between different groups, because
Mm-hmm.
that's like, you know, literally true, but also a wonderful metaphor for like different identities within a single space. Um, and then I just really like the way that, like you're saying, that they're important because it's like an invented tradition, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this kingdom is effortfully pulling on this
Yes.
folklore for its own legitimization, which I
Mm-hmm.
love.
Yeah, and I think that that's like, you know, you can talk about it in these like high, like kind of literary academic terms, but it's like completely true to reality. I mean, in America, we have an entire holiday celebrating like the completely fictitious narrative that like the pilgrims just peacefully like broke bread with Native Americans, but that's like so fundamental to like the American concept of like the nation state and American history. So like every nation has that. You know, Hungary has the story about the Turul leading the Magyar tribes to the uninhabited Carpathian Basin. You know, like every state has these things that they believe. And I wanted to, you know, lean into that and explore that in a real sense that, you know, that showed how incredibly powerful these national myths are and can be.
Yeah.
So, Ava, titillate us with some of your favorite myths and folk tales that you put into the book and your particular twists on them. Because my favorite parts of the book are where I do not know how to pronounce your
Oh,
protagonist's name.
no worry.
When your protagonist is telling the other protagonist stories on their journey. And there's one about a woman whose husband is like a nine-headed monster who's eating these children, and they stay together at the end. And
Yeah.
I thought that was so fascinating to me, and I really liked it. So tell us about where
Yeah.
it came from.
So that actually is one of the rare ones that like actually came originally from an actual source. Like most of them I just made up because that was more fun. But this one is actually from this medieval Hungarian ballad about like a knight who's basically a serial killer, but in like he's a serial killer of women. I don't know why this is a ballad. Like I don't know why this exists. But basically he takes this woman, he's an errant knight, and he takes this woman, like he seduces her and takes her under the tree. It's the citrus tree, and they're like having their little moment. And then she looks up and she sees all the severed heads of like women that he's killed before. Um, and I was just what what is going on here? like what is this? There's so many bizarre like little stories like this.
And
And
often so violent. And I love that you kept
yeah,
that violence and the dark, just the dark gore of like high Middle Ages folklore is
yeah,
very alive in your book.
yeah, and that's the thing. Like, this was such because of like the way that Christianity kind of functioned and was like interpreted during this period. Like, I think that that's like something people don't understand. That's why like things were so violent during this time period, ironically, because that's why you have all these like insane torture devices because they actually thought that torture was like mercy compared to murdering someone before confession because that meant that your soul, you know, goes to hell and it also blackens the soul of the person who kills you. So basically like all of this horrific torture and like maiming and you know self-flagellation was like cool. Like
And this is
Christianity.
Rebecca's simple ideas evolving into extremely
Yeah.
elaborate and obviously cruel scenarios.
Yeah.
Um, you should talk, Rebecca, and I know you're over this, you're on to Babel now, but like the mythology that is invented in your Poppy War
Mhm.
trilogy has to me, kind of plays a similar role as Ava's in terms of it being sort of a indigenous mythologies that allow protagonists to access power that others can't, you know, like it fulfills a similar narrative role. Where did you get your stories for this?
Oh, I mean, just out of Chinese folklore, like anybody who reads the popular trilogy and is familiar with some of the Chinese classics, we'll see that a lot of names and plot lines are drawn straight from the investiture of the gods, Feng Shen Yan Yi. But actually, when we were planning this chat, one of the questions, Alix, that you came up with was why is there always this like trope of like a myth about some like hidden power that all the characters hear, and they're like, oh, what a cute legend. I wonder
if that'll be plot relevant later.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to say about that is that that trope is wonderful because it acts as such excellent foreshadowing and exposition all at once. Like literally all you have to do is have somebody tell a story in the first chapter, and that explains the entire magic system and how your protagonist is going to acquire that magic. But the fun twist I got to do on it with the Poppy War is subvert all of those myths later and explain how those myths were incredibly self-serving and biased. So the first time Rin hears about like Spearleys, for example, right, it's in a classroom. The other trope I really like is like instructors like teaching students things, because then you get exposition, but you also get pushback on that exposition, so you can do historiography and have multiple viewpoints without being a confusing narrator. So this is why I write books set in schools. So people are
genius. I mean,
very economical, yeah.
Yeah, whereas I, in Once and Future Witches, had to just straight up be like, and now here's a fairy tale. We're cutting this chapter. Let's get ready.
No, I love those so much. They were so good. But I was gonna say, yeah, one thing that I really appreciate in the Poppy War trilogy was the way that, you know, you hear these, like Rin first hears the myth of the trifecta like very, very early in, you know, the Poppy War. And then as like the series goes on, it kind of gets so corroded because she realizes the truth behind all of these things. And even, you know, shamanism, which is this like, you know, ancient indigenous magic, is like co-opted by people like, you know, the House of Yin and stuff, and like Yin Viceroy is like portraying himself as, you know, the revolutionary, the modernist, but even he is kind of relying on, you know, shamanism for power. So I love the kind of like, I don't know, the hypocrisy, I guess. Yeah,
you have to
like,
build a mythology and then subvert it, and both of you do that, and it's kind of an incredible trick, just as a writer, because I was thinking about it and I realized like secondary world fantasies often sort of naturally do have a lot of these national. I'm sorry, my extremely stupid cat got in. He's just
has that cat been there the whole time?
Okay.
No, he found a closed door and he started yelling at it until I opened it. He's not.
The whole chat is just show cat.
No, my husband just came off screen and like hooked him with a cane and got him. Anyway, no, just okay. So secondary world fantasies take so much world building, and you're like, often people are working in myths and like, to use the terrible but useful Avatar: The Last Airbender, you know, like you get these mythologies about each nation, you know, like the Fire Nation is XYZ, the Water Tribe is whatever, many of which are problematic on further inspection. But to build all that into secondary world and then subvert it, which I think both of you do in your work, is just technically hard without being really confusing. And I really appreciate that Rebecca is like, oh, I cheat and I have teachers say these things. That's wonderful.
It's so fun to read though. Like oh my god, the scenes at Sinegard are still, I think, some of my favorite scenes of the whole trilogy.
Well, if you like the Sinegard scenes, you'll like all of Babel, because that's all the academia part in one book. But I was gonna say there's the acknowledgement of the myth, and then the realization that the myth is manufactured. And I'm gonna call it the prestige, the third part, because I'm on an annoying Christopher Nolan kick. But then the third part is taking control of the narrative, right? Mm-hmm. Which is something that Rin does in the Poppy War trilogy, and also something, I don't want to spoil the Ultimate Woodsman, but something, Ava, that you acknowledge as well. And the way that it happens in the Poppy War trilogy is like halfway through the second book, Ren realizes that all of these stories that she's grown up hearing are designed by. So like, there's one story that she tells her friend Naja, which is about the creation of like humankind, and it's about the goddess Nuwa who takes mud and at first intricately forms, these like wonderful, beautiful human beings, and those are the aristocrats. But then she gets tired and she runs out of good mud, so she starts taking like the bad river mud and she puts it on a rope, and then she swings the rope, and then all those clumps, like those are the peasants. And she tells Naja, like, this is the story I
That's
grew up with.
real.
We were just like cool with it, and you realize like you guys tell that story so that we believe we're mud. And it's like drawing back the curtains of the shadow puppet show and seeing like the people behind the scenes. But then in the third book, which is really just the Communist Manifesto, she realizes the importance of designing these narratives and starts employing policies to the effect of like self-aggrandizement, and like with a real awareness of how this is going to be perceived, how this contributes to her public image, which is inspired, right, by like the PRC, or the Communist Parties of China's like real talent at storytelling and self myth making. And yeah, so Ava, how do you handle the prestige? Which is not a really good term for it, but it's what I'm going to use now.
No, it's good. I think like I always wanted to kind of show the hypocrisy. Like you said, I wanted to show the moment where, like, again, like this is kind of mild spoilers, but like the scene where EVK realizes why the king has been doing what he's doing is so important for her, because she realizes that these stories that she's always been told are not like like they're not true, they're not real, but they are, in a sense. They are what you make them, basically. And I think that that's the moment when she realizes that she is going to take control of the narrative, in a similar way that Rin ultimately does. But it takes a long time for her to get to that state and realize that, because she's grown up, believing, like Rin has grown up believing that, like, the Southern people are just inherently lesser. She's grown up believing that this kind of magic and this kind of power is inaccessible to her. Yeah, so I feel like I can't talk like too much about it without like a ton of spoilers.
One of my questions was literally about like endings and what constitutes a happy ending in like a world where the nation state itself is questionable. And I'm like, I don't know if we can talk about that. So instead, what I want to ask about is basically the role of violence. In particular, the way you guys are talking about sort of like taking control of these narratives is like the pivotal point for your characters. And I love that. But there's also, I think violence plays a very like, let me remember my grad school days. To talk about statehood and violence is kind of to talk about Weber and the idea of the monopoly of violence being one of the kind of defining characteristics of what makes a state, is that a state is an entity that holds the exclusive right to enact violence on people in a particular geographic space. And so to question that right to violence, to reclaim that violence for yourself, is in many ways sort of an anti-state activity in and of itself, which I think is all summed up in the title of your next book, Rebecca, unless I'm wrong. So how did you use violence in your books? What are your thoughts on it?
I guess I can.
It's your book club.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I think, well, I don't know, I've talked about this a little bit before, but kind of like the seed of, to go back to like what you said about the germ of an idea. So the original like germ of the idea of this book was that I read this like throwaway sentence about Saint Stephen, who's the first Christian king of Hungary. And he basically, all of his sons like died before they became of age. So his heir apparent was his nephew, but his nephew was a pagan. So he had his nephew's eyes stabbed out because he didn't want a pagan to inherit the throne.
Cool yeah, and chill,
just cool, right? Normal behavior, normal world. But that was like the beginning of this book, and it was always going to be like an incredibly violent world, because it was going to be about the violence of state building and, you know, the violence of resistance. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's Charles Tilley who said that the state basically functions as like an organized crime ring where like it like justifies its existence by threatening you and then saying it's going to protect you from its own threat. Um, so that was just, I don't know, all of
I
these
find
things
it
are
interesting because like I mean, I'm not trying to call out your books as particularly violent, just to be clear, like in the secondary world fantasy world, like, you know, we live on a planet with Game of Thrones. There is a high level of violence inherent kind of in the genre at this point. But what interested me about your use of violence is that it is so often the state against its own, and that it's not, um, except in very particular circumstances, a righteous and necessary thing. Like a lot of the violence in secondary world fantasy is sort of righteous wars, unexamined sort of uses of force. We like heroes who are soldiers, etc. You know, like fantasy cops are very popular, that kind of thing. And both of your all's sort of focuses first on sort of what states do to citizens.
yeah, and I think what states kind of make citizens do to themselves. I mean, like the
Yeah. Hmm.
literal self-flagellation is a big theme in The Wolf and the Woodsman, but it's also really present in the Poppy War too. I mean, the, you know, physical, like psychological toll that it like takes on Rin to, you know, to use shamanism is immense, and she like uses literal self-harm at points to, you know, to access her power. And I think there's this really interesting, not to just like fangirl over like the Poppy War, but like it's so interesting that how the theme of like autonomy plays out on both like the macro and the micro scale, because there's this whole thread about like who has the right to rule. Are the Nikara like capable of ruling themselves? And that kind of plays out in like Rin's own world and her own body in a sense. She's like, who really controls me? Do I like, am I the phoenix, or is the phoenix controlling me? Like she's kind of almost looking for, you know, up until book 3, she's almost looking for someone to subjugate her, to tell her what to believe in. Why? Sorry, that's just my like fangirling.
Well, you said autonomy, so now I'm going to talk about Fanon for a long time. Um, okay, so the original question was the use of violence and the role of violence, right? And yeah, like there's state imposed violence, but I think what I'm struggling a lot with right now, and I think I struggled a lot with it in the Poppy War trilogy too, but didn't like realize it as much, is the role of revolutionary violence and the glorification of the violence of the resistance. And I'm reading Arendt right now, so this is where all this is coming from. But there
My
is
sympathies.
Yeah.
no, she's great. Very actually in comparison to the rest. But there is this tendency of the new left, and I'm talking about quotes like Mao being like power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and Fanon going on and on about how violence is like, my next book is titled The Necessity of Violence. And you know, Sartre in his preface to The Wretched of the Earth, like extolling this cleansing necessary violence. And I think there is a danger of glorification of violence as catharsis. And right, like I think this is a misreading of the first Poppy War book, which ends with genocide, but like retributive genocide, right? And this is not a perfect comparison, but it's relevant to conversations about like Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards and what that violence does, and whether it's redemptive, whether it's cathartic, like who it's good for. So like, and then Arendt's argument is like violence is it's instrumental. It is a means to an end. It's best used as a means to a short-term goal. But there is always the danger of the means overwhelming the ends, especially as we move into a world where like there are nuclear weapons, right? Like there's state surveillance, like violence is no longer this like easily contained thing. And yeah, so I'm struggling. Well, so Babel talks about why, so Babel plays into this a little bit with the glorification of revolutionary violence, but I'm struggling a lot with nonviolent resistance and the moral pureness of those. And
And then
yeah, I don't
I'm
know.
always caught, I always sort of enjoyed these conversations. And then I have this feeling of someone else watching in bad faith. And there's sort of bad faith people who are always excited to point to the violence of revolutions and to sort of undermine the entire revolutionary spirit by saying they're just as bad. Like, look at these acts of horror that have been committed in the name of the revolution or in the name of liberal policy or blah, 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 blah. And so I always get stressed that these like complicated discussions of when is violence necessary, what legitimizes it, what glorifies it, what are these lines, will be instead used for the language of, in short, like fascism or legitimizing state power and fascism, in the ways that people are so uncomfortable with even a hint of violence or property destruction in, like, civil rights movements. Um, I never
Yeah.
know which side to err on there. There's two very ugly things there.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a neoliberal world, so it's always kind of this balancing act of being like I don't know, of being acceptably violent, basically. And I think that you have like a little more leeway if you're writing secondary world fantasy, which is why I do it because like writing historical fantasy is like kind of terrifying to me.
Oh, it's a huge nightmare.
Yeah, like
Speaking of,
I would much
is
rather just like make things up than do research, which is like
uses very well researched made up stuff. Is Babel, just if I may just ask about what's going up, is Babel in an alternate history or is it secondary world?
So it's like the history of our world, but with alternate explanations for stuff that did in fact happen. So much like the Once and Future Witches.
I'm sure, but with like more footnotes and better better citations.
are there going to be footnotes in the book?
There's so many footnotes. And I really want to ask if I can narrate the footnotes because I think that would be fun.
Oh my God.
Would be
Yes, I'm
amazing.
so excited.
Wait,
If that's a
Alix, did you do your
special,
own footnotes or did you have your audiobook narrator do them
oh,
before?
my audiobook narrator did them, but she was also kind of a genius, and that was like just I lucked out on that one. An actual woman named January narrated the 10,000 Doors of January, and she's fantastic, just for the record.
Really? Like, how did you find her?
They were like, Hachette was like, we'll talk to you, we'll have some samples about who could do this. And then they got back to me and were like, actually, we found the right person. This is who it's going to be. And I was like, you're right. That's a good choice. You did it.
That's incredible.
It's a lie. They put out a casting call for January. Called May audition, and they said no.
Okay, so we are almost out of time before we do audience questions, and I think that people in the chat are encouraged to put questions there for in the next few minutes. And we've already touched on this quite a bit, but I'm greedy and I know you've both had announcements. So what is coming next from both of you?
Yeah, so I recently was able to announce my YA debut, A Study in Drowning, which is basically if you've read slash seen the movie Possession. Well, actually, don't watch the movie; it's horrible. But the book Possession is amazing, and it's basically like a literary mystery where these two characters are. It was really inspired by like anti-Stratfordian theory, which is the theory that Shakespeare was not actually Shakespeare, and he was like Francis Bacon or some other random guy. So it's about these two academics who try to prove that their kind of national author was actually a fraud. And it's a romance. It's like the first kind of real romance I've ever written.
Okay, all right.
That's
And just
that.
side note for the people who maybe have not read The Wolf and the Woodsman yet, and you might be thinking like, it's a lot about state power and mythology. Very interesting. I just want you to know that there's a lot of yearning,
Yes,
like
there's,
so
to be fair,
much.
yes,
And it's
there's
crucial to me personally.
yes, there's definitely a strong romantic element. And then I do have a second book with Voyager, which is coming out next June, and that is like straight horror. Like Wolf and the Woodsman is like has kind of horror elements, but this is like straight horror set in the Victorian era, Odessa, Ukraine. And it's a retelling of the Juniper Tree, so it's about like
Ooh.
cannibalism.
Ooh.
And David thinks it's super bleak. So coming from the guy who edited the Poppy War, like I don't even know how to take that, but like that's that. And hopefully I'll be able to like officially announce that soon.
Excited for that pain. And then you have Babel coming up if you want to do the any more about that.
I do have Babel coming out next year. And I think I've said all I needed to say about it. It's about Oxford. It's very much about Oxford. And it's like a response to The Secret History, which is one of my favorite books ever. But it's so cool that you mentioned Possession, Ava, because I have another contracted book for Voyager also that I have to write at some point. And it's not a full idea yet, but I also recently finished Possession, and I really
It's so good.
of just like hunts through the archives and
Yes.
like about people who died like a long time
Romantic
ago.
hunts through the archives or
Yes.
just like
No,
right at
I
the
don't do
peak?
romance.
Oh,
That is
come
prohibited.
on.
But I also just watched Christopher Nolan's
What is going
newest
on in your
film,
household?
Tenet, which is about time travel. And so, okay,
Okay,
so
I could talk for a long time about Tenet. I'm very excited.
they do this thing called the temporal pincer. Okay, so in Tenet they can move forward and backwards through time, but the temporal pincer is you like do an operation forwards, but then with all that knowledge, you have the second half of your team do the operation backwards. So you like pincer. Anyways, so Possession meets Tenet with like the archives, with like time moving in different directions, and like,
Oh my God.
but the main
That
character is a history grad student, and that is what I need to write next.
that is.
Please,
It
we all
sounds a
need to
little
read
like This
that.
Is How You Lose the Time War, like in the way that they were passing messages to each other through time was great. I loved the mechanics of that book.
I have to read that. What are you working on next?
Oh, y'all are so
Well, you
fast.
have a Spindle Splintered coming
I'm so
out.
stressed.
Hello.
I have a novella, like a reasonable
Yes.
short 100-page
It's
novella
so
coming
good. So
out.
good.
Which is Sleeping Beauty meets Spider-Verse. So
It's
like if
amazing.
all the Sleeping Beauties from different versions collided together into one version, it's very light and silly. And if you read Once and Future Witches and were like, this person is dark and serious and intellectual, let's just skip that novella. That's what that is. I had a really good time writing it. And then the next book is not coming out for a million years because I'm pokey. But I'm calling it like Kentucky Gothic Beauty and the Beast kind of a thing. So it's the most Kentucky thing and the most contemporary thing and kind of the most personal. And I'm just like already sweaty about it, talking about it.
Oh.
That'll be out from Tor eventually someday.
Oh, that's so exciting. Also, you need to stop writing books that make me cry because literally, even a Spindle Splintered like had me teary-eyed. And I know you were like, this is so light, like this is great. I was like, I'm so excited to read something light. And then I was like at the
I
end, like,
mean,
oh my
one of the
God.
Goodreads reviews, not that I would ever check Goodreads, I've never done this. Somebody told me that one of the Goodreads reviews was it's Shrek the Third
Oh my God.
Spider-Verse. And I was like, I've done it. I've achieved my dreams.
Yeah, that's just peak literature.
Okay, I guess we should do questions from the audience if the moderators want to come back, either as disembodied
Sure.
voices, as real people,
Yeah,
whichever.
I'm back as a voice. We have some interesting questions here. Here's one. Whoops, where did she go? Sorry, where did that one go, Donna? Can you move it along? I'm not used to Donna's computer. Oh yeah. Okay, from Ashley, for anyone. She says, as someone who used to read a lot of dystopian, in quotes, dystopian books, I noticed it's a very dangerous tendency for authors to resolve books' conflicts by saying, Here's a new system, happily ever after, which is less true now, but was quite common in the early 2000s. How do you try to avoid these cleaner forms of resolution for the book's systemic conflicts? Anybody?
I'll jump in if nobody's
Yeah,
ready. I
no,
will
go
say
for it.
the very basic thing that I keep in mind, that Lois McMaster Bujold said in an interview a long time ago, and I read it as a baby writer. I think it's in the back of one of her Kosugen Saga books. So before I was even trying to write, and she was like, the thing about a good ending is that you want to leave your characters with work to do. Like the vision of them going on to continue the work, whatever it is, like the central theme and heart of your book, should be the work that they're doing. And so I try to make a huge mess at the end that they're going to have to keep working toward.
This one from Norway.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think that was actually one of the challenges for me because I wanted this to very much be like a standalone and I wanted to make it, it's not like a fairy tale retelling, no matter how many times people say it is. It's not, I promise it's not. Like, I swear. I wanted it to be like almost a parody of a fairy tale in like the sense that it like has this illusion of being neatly wrapped up, but there's still a lot of kind of loose threads to the point where like people have DM'd me like really annoyedly asking what happens after the end of the book. Yeah.
I think the trouble with regime replacement stories is that like we have not figured out the answer to like government, like as in like 21st century society. So books where there's like a revolution and a successful revolution, and that's implied to be the happy ending, are extremely frustrating to me because revolutions usually usher in an era of terror and violence and messiness. And a lot of people don't like the way that the popular trilogy ends because the revolutionaries don't win. But we know what happens when the communist revolutionary won, and that's the reality that we're living with. So just as you said, Alex, I think it's important to acknowledge the messiness and the continuation of struggle and to leave open endings for troubling of critical junctures instead of saying that democracy, there you go, like now we are a democratic republic and everything's okay, because those don't really work and we don't really have the answer yet. And we don't have the answer to colonialism either. We're still living with those ramifications and we still don't have like a properly like post-colonial, like free of all colonial influence, free of those traumatic repercussions, like country anywhere in the world. And I like books that acknowledge that there's more work to be done. And I agree that the happy endings of the perfect new government are really so unbelievable that I don't like picking up those books at all.
Thank you. From Minna, what was the seed for each of your stories or one of your stories? The first song, line, character, plot idea, or vibe that got the ball rolling?
Yeah, I mean, I already kind of said just that anecdote about Saint Stephen having his nephew's eye stabbed out. It was just like I was on a weird like Wikipedia rabbit hole like search, and I just stumbled upon that kind of throwaway sentence, and then it just grew from there. So yeah.
Yeah, mine for for Spindle Splintered, it was watching Spider-Verse and being like, that is the best retelling of anything I've ever seen in my entire life. It is a perfect and flawless film. For Once and Future Witches, I had like that initial suffragettes but witches idea, and it was a huge struggle. Second books can be hard. I rewrote the beginning like a undisclosed number of times, and it didn't really come together until I realized that I was like trying to write people who didn't have my cultural background, like they were just like urban white people in a city in the 19th century. And so I like rooted them in like I restarted the book talking in like my mama's voice and like making it Appalachian witchcraft and like making them have a family history that made sense to me, like changed everything for me, and it worked after that.
I think for Babel, it originated when I was doing a year at Oxford. And I think in academia, we like using really dramatic metaphorical language for the kind of shifts that we are advocating for. So like we must violently interrogate the institution means like publish a paper about like the history of like this one program. And then I started wondering, right, like this is why we have papers like decolonization is not a metaphor, which I agree with. And then I started wondering what if in fact the decolonization of the academy was not a metaphor and we actually tore it apart at its roots, which I guess is a spoiler for the ending of Babel, but there you go.
So another sort of process question from our friend Bart. When writing your books, was there anything that surprised you as you went along? For example, a plot twist or a character development that you didn't expect?
Actually, the book was a lot less romantic when it first sold, and like ironically, it was my editor, David, who encouraged me to like make it more romance, and he was like, "No, the romance is like the heart of this book," and I didn't really think of myself as someone who like wrote romance at all. So that was definitely a surprise to me, and I think will probably be surprising to people who have read the book because it is like quite romantic now. But yeah, that was not always the case.
I'm making this face because I just cannot imagine having a conversation with David.
Yeah, there were a lot of interesting conversations had on that front.
I can't think of anything super surprising except in broad strokes, once again, how hard it is to write a second book. I just figured that once I had written a novel, and I realize I'm talking to people who've like written 3 already, and that's annoying, but I'm just gonna ignore that. But like, I just figured that it would be like a thing I knew how to do now. And the thing that people, writers on Twitter say often, where you never figure out how to write books, you just figure out how to write the book you're currently writing. That seems true. I was surprised by that. I'm bummed by that. I remain bummed by that.
I'm also bummed that it never gets easier. Like it somehow only ever gets harder. And the second book in a trilogy is uniquely difficult. I'm gonna drop a graph in the air because there's like the sustained plot line and then the plot line from book 1 to 2, and then like its own plot line, and then the plot line that starts in 2 and ends in 3. So you get like 4 different plot lines stacking over each other, and it's really hard. But Ava, I'm guessing these books that you've mentioned already have draft versions, so you have gotten over the sophomore slump. Good for you.
Yeah, I was really lucky in that my book was literally bought in March of 2019. So I was like, I guess I'm doing fuck all for the next 2 years. And I just wrote like 2 more books before I really knew what it was like to like revise a book. So I was still very like fresh-eyed and like innocent when I wrote these other 2 books. And I think like any future books will be like a huge struggle.
So we have a question about balancing writing with a day job or with going to school. Did you all write while you were working a day job? How did you manage your research, writing, and other responsibilities? Or if you're feral kids, for that matter.
Yeah. I wrote this book while I was working part-time at like a AI robotics startup, which was just a job that I took because it had nothing to do with writing and I needed to like have my brain free for like that and just like sit at my desk and brainstorm. So yeah, I'm sure you both have much more interesting answers to that.
No, mine is that I cheat. I mean, I wrote the first one while I was adjuncting, mostly, but I don't, full respect to people who do this. I fully believe it is possible, but I just want to be transparently clear that I do not raise my children full time and maintain a household and then write on the side. I write and my husband does literally all of that. And without the privilege of being able to be a full-time writer who can, I'm sorry, support the family, then like I just don't think that that's how I operate as a person. So the way I do it is through immense luck and privilege and a good husband.
I'm smiling because usually I make dinner, but tonight my boyfriend's making chili because I'm on this panel and I'm smelling like really strong smells, but they're not the right smells.
No.
So I just don't know what I'm gonna go eat after. But yeah, I have written as a full-time student and also as a part-time student, I guess I was this past year. And I get this question all the time and it's just really hard and impossible and I don't sleep that much. And I have a bunch of health problems because I'm a workaholic. And yeah, I don't know. I think what helps is writing. If you are a full-time student, something that helped me was writing stuff that aligns very closely to what you're studying. So like classes for me were also research for the book, and interesting things that we talked about in discussion section became dialogues in between the characters. And that's like the only way that I can shave a little bit of time off of the writing process itself.
Yeah, I cannot even imagine. Like, my partner is a PhD student, and like our apartment is just like insanity. Like, I can't even imagine trying to do both at once. It's just crazy. So I have so much respect for you. Like, it's unbelievable.
Okay, so final question before we let you guys go, from Caitlin. She asks, what question or subject does each panelist wish they were asked about more? I always love to know. So.
I have a really goofy answer, which is that I wish someone had asked me who my dream dinner party guest is, because like I always assumed I would get that question, but I never have. And my dream dinner party guest is Tarar. You should Google him, but also don't Google him if you like don't have a strong stomach. But I'm obsessed with him.
Now you have to tell us why.
Okay, so he was this French man who was around during the French Revolution, and he had some sort of condition where he was just ravenously hungry all the time, and he would just eat anything. Like, he would just eat like cats and dogs, like their bones and stuff, like everything. Like,
I just
so
want you to know that the
bizarre.
chat is losing its mind right now if you're not.
Okay, but this actually relates to my second book, my horror novel, because the
Oh
villain is
no.
based off Terrar. So maybe this is why David thinks this book is like horrifically bleak. But I just like, my favorite part about him is that like he was like a traveling showman. Like, this is like what he did for like his job, was just like eat things. But my favorite part about this is this was just like happening contemporaneously with the French Revolution. So if you were like a French peasant, you'd be like, I wonder what I'm gonna do tonight. I mean, we could go watch the guillotines, or we could like go watch Torar eat our cat. Like, and that was
Toss
just
up,
like,
a real toss up.
yeah, like. Oh my God, I'm so sorry to chat for talking about Torar.
My favorite was the people who had an idea of who that was before you explained, and were like, oh no.
I'm
I think
sorry.
the only thing I wish that people ask me about more is I just want to be talking about the books that I'm reading literally all the time. Like, that's my default mode. My husband knows this. He's like, no, stop. You already told me the plot of the book that you were reading. Like, you did the whole thing. I remember it all. Like, that's just where I'm at as a person.
I would love to talk more about like unlikely influences for your writing, because like people like read you as a certain way, right? And they're like, Ken Liu is an influence, like Chinese mythology is an influence, and that's all true. But I would love to talk about Christopher Nolan for like a whole hour, and how he is a traumatized rationalist, and like the deep impact that all of his films and The Dark Knight and Hans Zimmer's scores have had on my creative development. And yeah, just I'm gonna like to make it sound more sophisticated, like unlikely genealogies of you as a writer would be a really fun thing to talk about.
It's
I
true
do.
because
I would like to know, this is very important to me personally. Are you an Interstellar fan?
Okay, yes, and a lot of a lot of people aren't.
I know.
Okay, like even the line where she's like love is the force. I'm like, yes, Anne Hathaway, like
I
yes.
know, she's right. She should have gone to that other damn planet because
They
love
should
is
have
the
gone
fourth
there
dimension.
first. We love Interstellar so much. We bought like the book by the scientist who Nolan consulted on black holes and read that. And I was like reading this chapter on black holes, and like I did that thing where your eyes slip and like see like a sentence like later in the page, and it just says like sphere of fire. And I'm like, we're talking about like how, what is this? That's not right. So yeah, I think a
I
lot
think
of
that movie is like maybe one of my favorite Nolan movies, and I think it's fantastic. And every time I mention it, the internet like collectively rolls its eyes, and I just don't understand. I
I think
think,
it's like not cool to like Nolan, but I also think that that's wrong.
but I also think everyone else is wrong. We are right. Okay, I'm sorry. Was that our last question?
Ava hates Interstellar and she's
Yes,
cool
that
for
was
it.
it.
No, I'm actually just laughing because my partner in the other room loathes Interstellar so much. So I'm just like sitting here thinking about him like
I actually do love getting in fights about it. It's like one of my hobbies. So anytime.
yeah, I like that the whole chat is Hans Zimmer and also Terrar. Like